Princess Lirelei pressed her face against the cold metal window of the emergency meeting room. Below her, Zephyria was dying. Her beautiful home planet, once covered in sparkling crystal cities that caught sunlight like diamonds, now burned under rivers of black smoke. The crystal spires that had taken thousands of years to grow were cracking and falling like broken glass. The Devourers had arrived 3 days ago. Nobody saw them coming. One moment, children were playing in the crystal. Gardens and merchants were selling glowing fruits in the markets. The next moment, the sky turned dark with enemy ships. These weren't normal ships made of metal and circuits. The Devourer vessels looked alive, like giant black insects with wings that moved and breathed. They ate everything in their path. Buildings, trees, people, even the very ground itself. Lirelei turned away from the horrible sight outside and looked at the council chamber around her. This was supposed to be her moment of salvation. She had sent desperate messages across the galaxy, begging every major civilization for help. Surely someone would care that an entire planet was being murdered. The Altarian ambassador sat in his floating chair, his bright blue feathers puffed up to make him look important. Her's people were known as fierce warriors who could fly through space without ships. They had helped dozens of worlds before. Ambassador Thexnol cleared his throat and spoke in his musical voice. Princess Lirelei, the Altarian Empire, feels deep sorrow for your situation. However, our military analysts have determined that we cannot spare any forces at this time. Our own borders face potential threats, and we must protect our own people first. We hope you understand. The princess felt her heart sink. The Altarians were her strongest hope. If they wouldn't help, who would? Next to speak was the representative from the Cetacean Collective. These were the wise whale-like beings who lived in the deep oceans of water worlds. Their massive hologram flickered blue and green as the creature's ancient voice filled the room. Our computer models have run thousands of battle simulations. The probability of successfully defeating a devourer swarm of this size is less than 2%. Sending our forces would only result in unnecessary losses. We must preserve our strength for battles we can actually win. Logic demands this choice. One by one, the excuses came. The Karathi Trade Federation said they were economically unable to mount a rescue mission. The Silicon Brotherhood claimed their robot armies were undergoing maintenance upgrades. The Veltaran Merchant Guild offered to sell weapons at discounted emergency prices, but wouldn't send a single soldier. Each rejection felt like a knife in Lirelei's chest. She had attended diplomatic parties with these people. She had signed trade agreements and friendship treaties. She had danced at their cultural celebrations and learned their languages. Now, when her people were being eaten alive, they all had reasons to look the other way. The chamber grew quieter as more representatives made their apologies and left. Some didn't even bother with excuses. They just activated their hologram transmitters and vanished, leaving empty spaces where allies should have been. The princess watched her last hopes disappear one by one until the vast council chamber felt like a tomb. Finally, only one small group remained in the corner. 3 figures sat quietly in simple military uniforms that looked worn and patched. They weren't part of any major government or powerful empire. The princess had almost forgotten. They were there. The tallest of the 3 stood up slowly. She was a woman with short black hair and tired eyes. Her uniform had captain's bars on the collar, but they looked old and faded. This was Captain Kim, representing something called the Human Defense Coalition. Lirelei knew almost nothing about humans except what she heard in whispered stories. Other species called humans the killers. They said humans were the only race that fought wars for emotions instead of logic. They said humans never knew when to quit, never accepted reasonable losses, and never made peace when they could keep fighting instead. Most civilized species avoided them. Captain Kim walked across the empty chamber, her boots echoing in the silence. When she reached the princess, she didn't bow or use fancy diplomatic language. She just looked Lirelei straight in the eyes and spoke in a quiet, steady voice. "Your Highness will help." The princess stared at this strange human woman. These were the people the galaxy feared. These were the so-called monsters and killers, and they were the only ones offering to help her dying world. Why? Lorelei whispered. "Everyone else says it's impossible." Captain Kim glanced back at her two companions, then returned her gaze to the princess. "Maybe it is impossible, but that doesn't mean we won't try. Your people need help, and that's enough for us." For the first time in 3 days, Princess Lorelei felt a tiny spark of hope. The refugee station looked like a broken city floating in space. Thousands of survivors from different worlds had gathered here after escaping the Devourer attacks. The station's metal corridors were packed with families, carrying whatever they could save from their destroyed homes. Children from a dozen different species cried for parents who might never come back. The air smelled like fear, unwashed bodies, and the recycled oxygen that kept everyone alive. When the human ships appeared on the station's sensors, everything changed. The whispers started immediately, spreading through the crowded halls like wildfire. People stopped what they were doing and pressed their faces against the small windows to get a look at the approaching vessels. The human ships didn't look like the sleek, elegant craft that most civilized species used. These were ugly, practical machines that looked like they had been built for war and rebuilt many times. Scorch marks covered their hulls from countless battles. Weapons bristled from every surface. They looked dangerous and mean, like attack dogs made of metal and fury. A Velteran merchant with forearms and skin like purple leather grabbed his children and pulled them away from the window. His voice shook as he spoke to another refugee, standing nearby. "Those are the war makers," he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've heard stories about them. They don't fight wars like civilized people. They turn every small conflict into a complete disaster. When humans get involved, entire star systems burn." A Karathi trader with tentacles instead of legs nodded his bulbous head in agreement. His people were known for being calm and logical, but even he seemed frightened. "Humans never stop fighting," he said, his voice bubbling through the water-filled tank he wore around his neck. "Other species fight, for territory or resources or logical reasons, but humans, they wage war for emotions. They fight for things that don't even exist, like honor and justice and freedom. They're completely insane." More refugees gathered around the windows, watching the human ships dock with fascination and terror. Stories began to flow through the crowd like poison in water. Everyone had heard something about the humans, and none of it was good. An elderly Altarian woman with bright silver feathers spoke up from her floating chair. "My nephew served with humans once during the border wars. He said they never retreat, even when retreat is the smart thing to do. They just keep attacking until either they win or they're all dead. No middle ground, no compromise." A young cetacean, pup, barely old enough to speak, asked his mother in their singing language, "Why are they called the killers, Mama?" His mother's massive form shifted nervously in her water tank. "Because they're the only species that kills for strangers, little one. Other races fight to protect their own families and worlds, but humans will die for people they've never met, from planets they've never seen. It's not natural." Princess Lorelei walked through these crowds of frightened refugees toward the docking bay. Her royal robes, once beautiful and flowing, were now torn and stained from 3 days of running and hiding. Her hands shook as she moved, not from fear of the humans, but from the terrible weight of being responsible for her people's survival. She had grown up hearing the same stories about humans that everyone else knew. They were the bogeymen of the galaxy, the violent species that other civilizations used to scare their children into behaving. "Be good or the humans will come," mothers would say. "They fight wars over feelings and never know when to quit." But now these same monsters were her only hope. The thought made her stomach twist with worry and desperate gratitude at the same time. The docking bay doors opened with a loud hiss of escaping air. Princess Lorelei stood at the entrance, flanked by what remained of her royal guard. Only 3 soldiers had survived the evacuation, and they looked as exhausted and defeated as she felt. The first human to emerge from the ship was Captain Lee. She was shorter than Lorelei expected, with dark hair tied back in a simple ponytail, and scars on her face that spoke of many battles. Her uniform was clean but obviously old, with patches sewn over holes and rank insignia that had been replaced multiple times. Behind her came 2 other officers. Commander Park was a thin man, with kind eyes and gentle hands that looked strange on someone wearing a warrior's uniform. Commander Choi was younger, maybe barely old enough to fight, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had already seen too much war. The refugees who had followed the princess to the docking bay pressed against the walls, trying to get as far away from the humans as possible. Children hid behind their parents. Even the station's security guards looked nervous. Princess Lirelei had prepared herself for this meeting. She expected the humans to be arrogant mercenaries who would demand payment in gold or territory or political favors. She had practiced speeches about what her people could offer in exchange for military help. She was ready to negotiate like her diplomatic training had taught her. But when Captain Lee reached her, something unexpected happened. The human woman stopped, removed her battle helmet, and placed it under her arm. Then she did something that no one in the galaxy would have expected from one of the feared human killers. She bowed, not a small nod of acknowledgement, but a deep, respectful bow that showed genuine honor for the princess's position and suffering. "Your Highness," Captain Lee said in a quiet voice that somehow cut through all the noise and fear in the docking bay, "we're here to serve, no payment required." The words hit Princess Lirelei like a physical blow. No payment required. These humans, these supposed monsters who fought for profit and blood, were offering to die for her people without asking for anything in return. For the first time since the Devourers had come, Princess Lirelei felt something other than despair. It was small and fragile, but it was real. It was hope. The first thing that shocked the galaxy was how quickly everything changed once the humans arrived. Other species had been fighting the Devourers for months using traditional military tactics. They would send their best warships in organized formations, calculate the acceptable number of casualties, and retreat when losses reached predetermined limits. It was logical, civilized warfare that followed thousands of years of established rules. The humans threw all those rules out the window on their first day. Lieutenant Han looked at the cargo ship floating in the asteroid belt and saw something completely different from what anyone else would see. While other commanders saw a useless civilian vessel that should be evacuated, Han saw a weapon waiting to be born. Within 6 hours, his engineering teams had ripped out the cargo holds and stuffed them full of military-grade missiles. "Sir, this violates about 50 different safety regulations," his chief engineer reported, wiping grease from her hands. "One small explosion and the whole ship becomes a fireball." "Good," Han replied with a grin that made his crew nervous. "That's exactly what we want." The makeshift missile platform looked ridiculous compared to proper military vessels. It had no armor, no shields, and no escape pods. But when a Devourer scout ship approached what it thought was a helpless cargo hauler, Han's surprise attack destroyed the enemy vessel in seconds. The explosion was so bright that it could be seen from 3 star systems away. Word of the victory spread quickly through human communication networks. Within hours, dozens of other commanders were copying Han's idea, turning everything from passenger shuttles to mining equipment into improvised weapons of war. Commander Yoon took the concept even further. When his regular soldiers weren't enough to board and capture a damaged Devourer vessel, he did something that made other species question human sanity. He asked for volunteers from the refugee population. "I need people who want to fight back," Yoon announced over the station's communication system. "This is dangerous work. Most of you probably won't come back, but if we can capture that ship, we can save thousands of lives." The response overwhelmed him. Civilians who had never held weapons before lined up to join his boarding parties. A Zephyrian shopkeeper, who had lost his entire family, volunteered to carry explosives. An elderly Korathi teacher insisted on joining the assault team despite being 70 years old. Even children too young to fight begged to help by carrying supplies or medical equipment. These civilian volunteers fought with a fury that terrified even the Devourers. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. When professional soldiers might have retreated, the volunteers kept pushing forward, driven by rage and desperation and the human example of never giving up. The enemy tried to adapt to human tactics, but the humans changed faster than the Devourers could learn. When the aliens figured out how to detect missile-filled cargo ships, the humans started using passenger liners instead. When the Devourers learned to avoid civilian vessels entirely, the humans began disguising military ships as merchant craft. The real genius of human warfare wasn't in their technology or their weapons. It was in their complete willingness to abandon any tactic the moment it stopped working and try something completely different. Sergeant Kang learned this lesson while defending a refugee center on the moon of Xerion. His small team of 20 soldiers was supposed to hold the facility until evacuation ships arrived. The problem was that 3,000 Devourer ground troops had surrounded the building, and reinforcements were still 2 days away. "Sir, they've blocked our approach vectors," Kang reported to Lieutenant Zhang over the radio. "We can't get supplies in or people out. They've got us completely surrounded. Any other military commander would have ordered a retreat or negotiated a surrender to save lives." Lieutenant Zhang had a different idea. "Then we make new ones," he growled, already moving toward the supply closet where maintenance equipment was stored. What followed was 3 days of the most creative and desperate fighting the galaxy had ever seen. When the Devourers blocked the main entrances, Zhang's team used mining charges to blow new holes in the walls. When the enemy cut off their power, the humans rigged generators from crashed vehicles. When their ammunition ran low, they made weapons from medical supplies and kitchen equipment. The defenders turned the refugee center into a maze of improvised traps and hidden passages. They used children's toys as decoys to confuse enemy sensors. They redirected the building's water system to flood certain areas and electrify others. They even taught the refugees themselves how to fight, turning doctors and teachers into guerrilla warriors. For 3 straight days, Sergeant Kang's unit held that position against odds that should have been impossible. They lost half their people, but they saved every single refugee in the center. When relief forces finally arrived, they found Devourer bodies piled everywhere and 20 exhausted humans still ready to keep fighting. News of the battle spread across the galaxy within hours. Other species watched the recordings with a mixture of horror and amazement. This wasn't how civilized warfare was supposed to work. Soldiers weren't supposed to turn civilians into fighters. Commanders weren't supposed to risk everything for people they didn't even know, but it was working. For the first time since the Devourer expansion began, the aliens were retreating. Not just from one battle or one system, but from entire sectors where humans had arrived. The creatures that had seemed unstoppable were suddenly avoiding any area where human ships had been spotted. The galaxy was learning a terrifying truth about humanity. These weren't just another species of warriors. They were something completely different. They didn't fight for territory or resources or logical reasons. They fought because they refused to let others suffer, even when helping meant certain death. And that made them the most dangerous opponents in the universe. The Devourer mothership was beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen before. It wasn't just big, it was impossibly massive, like a small moon made of black metal and living tissue. The ship stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction, its surface covered with thousands of smaller vessels that moved like insects crawling on a giant's skin. Weapons the size of skyscrapers jutted out from its hull, and strange organic tubes pulsed with sickly light as they fed energy throughout the massive structure. Princess Lirelai stood on the bridge of Captain Li's flagship, staring at the monster through the view screen. Her hands pressed against the cold metal railing so hard her knuckles turned white. This thing was hovering directly above her homeworld, positioning itself over the great crystal of Zephyria, like a vulture preparing to feast. The great crystal wasn't just a pretty rock. It was the heart of her entire species. Every Zephyrian who had ever lived was connected to it through invisible threads of thought and emotion. Children learned to speak by listening to the crystal's whispers. Adults found their life partners through the connections it created. When Zephyrians died, their memories joined the crystal's eternal song, making them immortal in a way. If the Devourers consumed the crystal, every Zephyrian in the galaxy would die instantly. Not just the ones still on the planet, but every single member of her species scattered across 1,000 worlds. It would be genocide on a scale that had never been attempted before. "Your Highness," Captain Li said quietly, "we need to move now. Our scouts report they're starting the feeding process." "Princess." Lirelai turned to face the human captain. Li looked tired but determined, checking weapons and equipment with the calm efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Around the bridge, other human officers prepared for what everyone knew would be a suicide mission. "Captain, please reconsider," the princess begged, her voice breaking with desperation. "No species in galactic history has ever successfully assaulted a mothership. They're too big, too well defended. The Altarians tried it once with their entire battle fleet. Less than 10% survived, and they never even got close to the core." Captain Lee looked up from the tactical display she was studying. Her eyes were calm but sad, like someone who had already accepted what was coming. "Your Highness, with respect, no species has really tried. The Altarians sent their ships in formation following their military doctrines. They fought like civilized. People fight wars, with rules and limits and acceptable losses." She gestured to the view screen where the human fleet was taking position. The ships looked tiny compared to the mothership, like toys scattered around a sleeping giant. "We don't fight like that." Lee turned to her officers and began giving orders in the crisp, clear voice of someone who had led soldiers into impossible battles before. "Commander Song, take your squadron around to the left side. I want you to hit their weapon clusters here and here." She pointed to spots on the tactical display. "You probably won't survive the run, but you might give us the opening we need. Commander." Song nodded without hesitation. He was a young man who looked like he should be in school, not leading a squadron of fighters into certain death. "Understood, Captain. It's been an honor serving with you." "Major Bay," Lee continued, "your demolition teams need to breach the hull at these coordinates. The ship's alive, so it'll try to heal itself. You'll have maybe 10 minutes to get inside, before the wounds close." Major Bay was a woman with scars on her face and hands that spoke of many battles. She checked her explosives one final time and gave a thumbs up. "We'll get you that hole, Captain. Count on it." Princess Lyrelei watched this exchange with growing amazement and horror. These humans were calmly planning their own deaths, as if they were discussing the weather. They knew the odds were impossible, but they weren't even considering retreat. The human fleet launched its attack with a fury that defied description. While other species would have probed for weaknesses or tried to negotiate, the humans threw everything they had at the mothership in one massive assault. Fighter squadrons dove straight into the enemy's defensive fire, trading their lives for small amounts of damage. Cruisers rammed into the mothership's weapon clusters, destroying themselves to create openings for others. In the middle of this chaos, Captain Lee led a small team of commandos in a desperate infiltration mission. They flew stolen Devourer craft directly into the wounds that Major Bay's explosives had created in the mothership's hull. Princess Lyrelei insisted on joining them, despite Lee's protests. Inside the mothership, everything was nightmare-made, real. The corridors were made of living tissue that pulsed and breathed around them. Strange organic machines lined the walls, feeding on captured energy and matter from destroyed worlds. The air itself felt hostile, thick with alien scents and the sound of distant screaming. Corporal Na led the advance team through the maze of passages. He was a quiet man who moved like a ghost, finding paths through the organic maze that others would have missed. Behind him came Private Joe, barely old enough to be a soldier, but already a veteran of a dozen battles against the Devourers. "The core chamber should be through here," Na whispered, using his scanner to peer through the living walls. "But the readings are strange. There's something big in there, something that doesn't match any of our intelligence reports." They fought their way through biomechanical defenders that looked like crosses between machines and spiders. These creatures moved with horrifying speed, their metal claws dripping with acid that could eat through armor in seconds. The humans met them with gunfire and improvised explosives, never giving ground despite being outnumbered 100 to 1. During a brief pause in the fighting, Princess Lyrelei found herself crouched behind a piece of wreckage next to Corporal. "Josh?" The human soldier was calmly reloading his weapon, his hands steady despite the chaos around them. Blood ran down his face from a dozen small cuts, but he seemed completely focused on the job ahead. "Why?" she gasped, still struggling to understand what she was witnessing. "Why are you dying for strangers? My people mean nothing to your species. We've never traded with Earth or signed treaties with humanity. You don't even know us." Corporal Na looked at her with eyes that were older than his face suggested. He finished loading his weapon and checked the charge on his last grenade before answering. "Because genocide is wrong, Your Highness," he said simply. It doesn't matter if we know you or not. It doesn't matter if you can help us later or give us rewards. What the Devourers are doing to your people is evil, and we can't let evil win when we have the power to stop it. Simple as that. The core chamber lay just ahead, through a final corridor lined with the most dangerous defenders they had yet encountered. Intelligence reports suggested they would face automated systems and maybe a few high-level Devourer commanders. What they actually found was something that made Princess Lyrelai's blood freeze in her veins. The Devourer Queen herself waited for them. She was massive, easily 3 times the size of any human, with 4 arms that ended in razor-sharp claws and a face that looked like a beautiful woman's features carved from black metal. Around her, the great crystal of Zephyria pulsed with stolen light as feeding tubes slowly drained its power. The humans took one look at this impossible opponent and did something that no other species would have attempted. They charged. Their battle cry echoed through the organic corridors, a sound of pure human defiance that had been heard on 1,000 battlefields across the galaxy. For Zephyria, the sight that greeted the galaxy 3 months later was something nobody had thought possible. The massive Devourer mothership, which had seemed invincible just weeks before, was limping away from Zephyrian space like a wounded animal. Huge sections of its living hull were scarred and blackened from human weapons. One of its primary feeding arms hung useless and dead, severed by explosions that had rocked the ship from the inside out. Most shocking of all, the Devourer Queen herself bore visible wounds. Scanner readings from across the galaxy confirmed what seemed impossible. The creature that had personally consumed 17 civilizations was hurt. Deep cuts ran across her metallic face, and one of her 4 arms moved stiffly, damaged by human weapons in the core chamber battle. For the first time in over 200 years of expansion, the Devourers had been stopped. Not just delayed or temporarily set back, but actually forced to retreat and abandon their conquest. The news spread through galactic communication networks faster than light, carried by merchant ships and diplomatic channels to every corner of known space. On Zephyria itself, something beautiful was happening. The planet's crystal cities, which had been shattered and broken by the Devourer attack, were slowly growing back to life. But this time they weren't growing alone. Human engineers worked side by side with Zephyrian builders, combining alien crystal growing techniques with human construction methods to create structures more beautiful and stronger than anything either species had built before. Captain Lee stood in the rebuilt central plaza of the capital city, watching Zephyrian children play with human soldiers who had stayed behind to help with reconstruction. The kids had learned to speak basic human languages, and the soldiers had picked up enough Zephyrian to make jokes and tell stories. It was a sight that would have been impossible to imagine just months earlier. "Captain," called out Lieutenant Zhang, the same officer who had held the refugee center for 3 days during the war. "The council meeting is starting soon. The princess is asking for you." Lee nodded and made her way to the temporary government building where Princess Lyrelai was preparing for the most important speech of her life. The princess had been invited to address a special session of the Galactic Council, and her words today would change the course of history. The council chamber looked exactly the same as it had during those desperate days when Lyrelai had begged for help. The same species sat in their fancy chairs and floating platforms. The same holographic representatives flickered in their designated spaces. But everything felt different now. The air was thick with tension and embarrassment as representatives who had abandoned Zephyria faced the consequences of their choices. Princess Lyrelai entered the chamber no longer as a desperate refugee pleading for scraps of assistance. She walked like a queen, her head held high, flanked by human officers who had proven their loyalty in blood and fire. The torn robes and frightened expression were gone, replaced by royal garments that sparkled with both Zephyrian crystals and human metal, a symbol of the new alliance that had saved her world. She approached the central speaking platform where she had once begged for help and been ignored. This time, every representative in the chamber hung on her words. "Honored members of the Galactic Council," she began, her voice clear and strong. "3 months ago, I stood in this very spot as a desperate refugee. My people were dying, my world was burning, and I came to you begging for help. Each of you had perfectly reasonable excuses for why you couldn't assist us." She paused, letting her eyes move across the assembled representatives. Many of them looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats or avoiding her gaze entirely. "You called the humans killers," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You whispered about their violence and their refusal to abandon lost causes. You spoke of them with fear and disgust, treating them like monsters that civilized species should avoid." Ambassador Thexanol from the Altarian Empire shifted uncomfortably in his floating chair. His bright feathers had lost some of their luster, and he seemed smaller than he had during their first meeting. "But I have seen the truth about humanity," Princess Lyrelei declared. "Yes, they are killers, but they become killers only when faced with injustice that cannot be tolerated. The traits you call dangerous, their loyalty to strangers, their emotional bonds that cross species lines, their willingness to fight and die for abstract ideals like justice and freedom, these things don't make them monsters, they make them guardians." The Cetacean Collective's massive holographic representative remained completely silent, its ancient eyes unreadable. But smaller species throughout the chamber began to murmur among themselves, processing words that challenged everything they thought they knew about humanity. "When the Devourers came for my people, every one of you calculated the costs and decided we weren't worth saving," Lyrelei continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had survived the impossible. "The humans never made that calculation. They saw people in need and responded without thinking about profit or strategic advantage or acceptable losses. They risked everything for strangers they had never met." She gestured toward the viewing screen that showed images of Zephyria's reconstruction. Human and Zephyrian workers labored together, building something new and beautiful from the ashes of war. "The humans asked nothing in return for their sacrifice," she said. "They haven't demanded territory or trade agreements or political concessions. They simply did what they thought was right, and then stayed to help us rebuild. But the galaxy owes them far more than gratitude. We owe them recognition." The formal vote that followed was closer than it should have been. Several species abstained, still unwilling to fully acknowledge what had happened. But when the final tally was counted, humanity had won its first seat on the Galactic Council by a significant margin. Captain Lee accepted the honor with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout the crisis. Standing before representatives from across the galaxy, she delivered the shortest acceptance speech in Council history. "We're just doing what's right," she said simply. "That's all we've ever tried to do." In the months that followed, everything changed. The galaxy's communication networks buzzed with new stories almost daily. A mining colony under attack by space. Pirates sent a distress call directly to human forces instead of filing a formal request through council channels. A plague outbreak on a remote world was contained by human medical teams who arrived before the official aid committees had even finished their paperwork. When the artificial intelligence rebellion began on the rim worlds, 3 different species bypassed their own governments and sent urgent messages straight to human military commanders. When the Void Serpents emerged from dark space to threaten the core worlds, even the proud Altarians quietly requested human assistance through back channels. The pattern was clear to anyone paying attention. When hope seemed lost and official channels moved too slowly, people no longer called the Galactic Council first. They called the humans. And somehow, against all odds and logic, the humans always answered. The galaxy had learned that sometimes the monsters you fear are actually the heroes you need. And sometimes the most dangerous species in the universe is dangerous only to those who prey on the innocent. In the end, that made all the difference.